Hi, this is the safety meeting for September 29th, 2020 for the Rocky Mountain Flight Training Center, Aero Club. This month's presentation is on maintaining separation in flight, collision avoidance. Most mid-air collisions, MACs, occur in day visual meteorological conditions. The times of best visibility within 5 miles of an airport. They can also be correlated to traffic levels. Most occur between 10 a.m. and 5 p.m. on weekends during the warmer months, essentially when most traffic is in the air. Half of all collisions occur in the traffic pattern. Check ahead, behind, above, and below your aircraft throughout the traffic pattern and make sure final is clear before turning. Collision avoidance, see, sense, and separate. We can talk about these separately. Takeoff and climb. About 1 of every 10 midair collisions occur during traffic takeoff and climb. So ensure that the runway is clear before departing and listen for other inbound traffic. Make position reports and listen for other pilots' position reports at non-towered airports. When climbing out, use shallow S-turns to lower the nose occasionally to get a better view of airplanes that are directly in front of you. See and avoid. The rules for maintaining separation from other aircraft during VFR operations are spelled out in FAR 91. 113 Part B. When weather conditions permit, regardless of whether an operation is conducted under instrument flight rules or visual flight rules, vigilance shall be maintained by each person operating an aircraft so as to see and avoid other aircraft. See and avoid is the common terminology for this method of collision avoidance. Simply looking out the cockpit may not be enough to avoid a MAC or mid-air collision. Pilots need to know how to look and what to look for, which requires an understanding of the limitations of human vision and tactics to compensate for its deficiencies. Cruise. 1/4 of mid-air collisions occur during cruise flight. According to the National Transportation Safety Board, the majority of these accidents result from inattention of aircraft's crews. While cruise flight allows pilots the most time to look for traffic, it's also the longest phase of flight and the time of greatest complacency. Scan for traffic and enlist the help of your passengers to spot other aircraft. If possible, avoid high traffic areas such as airspace near nav aids and military training routes. Approach and descent and landing. Half of all collisions occur in the traffic pattern, and of these, 80% occur during final approach and landing. Check ahead, behind, above, and below your aircraft throughout the traffic pattern, and make sure your final is clear before turning. Any confusion about where other aircraft are or who is landing and in what order can have tragic consequences. This is particularly true at non-towered airports. One may conclude, for example, that no aircraft are in the pattern if there's a lack of activity on the frequency, but there may be aircraft operating without radios, or an inbound or outbound aircraft may be transmitting on the wrong frequency. How and when to look for traffic. The similarities of mid-air collisions are locations within 5 miles of an airport, within 3,000 feet of the ground, and instrument procedures in Class E airspace. If everybody has their favorite instrument approach that they want to shoot and you're not really doing that, as you would be in Colorado Springs here when you have ATC, even under visual flight rules, they are watching you and calling out other traffic. But if you, for instance, go to just lost my light. If you go to Lamar or La Junta under VFR, you're going to be doing that by yourself and mixing in with VFR traffic as well as anyone else shooting an approach. So those kind of locations can be very crowded. Situations. GPS and autopilots make it more likely airplanes will be on the same airway at the same altitude, as opposed to, just if you're doing regular navigation by maps or just using ground references. See and avoid has limitations of the eye. The eye is a lot better at noticing objects in motion than stationary objects, which unfortunately would be objects coming straight towards you. Always scan small sections of the sky, one section at a time, just like you would at night looking for traffic. Half of all MACs caused by a pilot not seeing due to visible limitations of the aircraft. As you see in the image here, blind spots. Over half of the accidents occur from someone being hit from behind, which is certainly a blind spot, not illustrated here in this image. The best approach, would be to make yourself very visible, especially when you're probably within 10 miles or so of a uncontrolled airport or even a controlled airport, to use your position lights, or in most cases what we have is our strobe lights. Strobe lights are probably a lot more, the flashing of the strobe lights is probably something that's a lot more noticeable, especially during twilight conditions. I think those are very helpful. Position reports in non-controlled field, you should be starting to be calling positions 10 miles out. Situational awareness, listening on the CTAF frequency, listening to what other pilots are saying, trying to get a mental picture of who's doing what in the traffic pattern. And assuming the other person isn't, is assuming the other person isn't making themselves visible. So if that's true, then you're assuming that they aren't using position lights. Their position reports may not be very accurate, and they may not have a situational awareness. They may not even be caring who's in the pattern. For instance, I guess if I was going to Springs East, I might say Springs East traffic, Cessna 123, 5 miles west of the airport, 500 feet above traffic pattern, crossing the airport from west to east, looking for the windsock, for instance, where most of the time it's possible that the wind is probably coming from close to the same direction as it was in the Springs. It does shift around a lot, and they have a sock at each end of the runway. And so that's actually telling people where you're coming from, where you're at, and where you're going. And so that's probably a wise thing to do. And then the more things, if you go to number 2 here, that you have working for you, the better. ADS-B traffic is very good. I do see a lot more traffic out there than I ever thought was there, and it's certainly when ATC tells you something is there. And then you look on your ADS-B readout, it is very helpful. So the more things you have going on, the better it is. Oh, I forgot to change this. Video presented some strategies. I couldn't get that video on here, I guess, but in any event. The proper altitude, adhering to VFR and IFR cruising altitudes is probably a little more important now than it was in the past, because if people are filing or are at those altitudes, then and they're using autopilots and GPS, it's more likely that they're there. This is all private pilot stuff for VFR flights above 3,000 feet AGL. And I guess I should say, 3,000 AGL, a lot of people going to Pueblo. Well, if Pueblo's 45 or 4,600 feet and the Springs is 6, you know, you've got that 1,500 foot difference right there. So, and then going out to Lamar or La Junta, you even have more of a disparity. So staying within 3,000 feet AGL is fairly easy when you leave the Springs, but when you go to lower elevations, you're now a lot higher than that. So you do need to think about adhering to those altitudes, which are, for VFR flights above 3,000 feet AGL between 0 and 179, fly altitudes of odd thousands plus 5. Between 180 and 359, which is anything west, flying even thousands plus 500 feet. I will say before I get to IFR that, you know, going from Pueblo to the Springs, you're always right on the edge of 359 to 050, or, you know, not 050, but 005. So you're really splitting hairs there sometimes, depending on which the nose of your plane, and so that discrepancy there is usually, for me, it's a little safer to aim directly in one direction than the other, but you know, you're basically going north or south coming from Pueblo or Springs, so that's a difficult one, I find. For IFR flights between 0 and 179, altitudes of odd thousands, which are evens, and you know, not even numbers, but not plus 5, and between 180 and 359, even thousands. And there's a little chart for you right here. I don't know, my pointer isn't working. Avoiding congested airspace. If VFR, avoid overflying approach fixes and nav aids, as that airspace can get congested. Also find out which special use airspace along your route is active, such as military operation areas and routes, warning areas and alert areas, which you can find, I think, in ForeFlight, and I should know this, I think it's under forms or my forms, where you can get to that information that on a paper sectional tells you who to call. But of course, you can always just call ATC and they would tell you if a military area is hot or not. And I guess in this case also, flying direct can take you right over something and it doesn't care where you are flying over, and you will get rerouted if you're on a flight plan, such as what's in this image here. So that's also, but that's a pretty common thing that most people have brought up in the past. But you know, flying direct is not, you really have to look and see what direct means, because a lot of times that's not the best way to go. Well, we did talk a couple times about turning on lights. You know, there are less accidents mid-airs at night, mostly because it is easier to see planes with lights on them. Even during the day, though, external lights make the aircraft more visible. Our rules say that we need to have the strobes on at all times. Now, civil airplanes do not follow those rules. If they do, because they will not have strobes, and if all they have is nav lights, the only required light would be the rotating beacon, which the T-41s, most of them don't have. So all a civil airplane has is a rotating red beacon, and could be on top of the cab, could be on top of the vertical stabilizer. And they're not required to turn on strobes unless they have them installed in the airplane. If they don't, they don't. Then they can turn, but turning on the nav lights during the day doesn't do as much, which is probably why the strobe lights on the military planes, I think, are a higher safety factor. Recognition lights increases the aircraft's visibility to others by a factor of 10. Turn the landing light on final approach and departure. If you receive a traffic alert or see oncoming traffic, turn on the landing light to make your aircraft easier to spot. Especially, I think, in Class Delta airspace, you'll find people doing that quite often, since they are not required to give you separation in Class D unless you're on the ground. They give you sequencing and separation, not separation in the air. That's a see and avoid thing, and if they can see you. If they can't see you, then it's up to you to separate yourself up there. More collision avoidance strategies. A sterile cockpit. The AOPA Safety Institute recommends that general aviation pilots limit idle conversation during the first and last 10 minutes of each flight in order to concentrate on aircraft operations and scanning for traffic. VFR flight following. Request ATC radar advisories and flight following service. Well, while only offered on a workload permitting basis, ATC may provide another set of watchful eyes. Of course, when you need them the most is when it's the busiest, or when it's the haziest or the smoggiest, and that's when they're the busiest, which means they may not be able to give you that, which means your situational awareness of what they're telling other people is probably a lot more helpful. Non-towered airports, monitor the CTAF and make position reports 10 miles out. We talked about that already. Include the airport name at the transmission's beginning and end. Lake Springs East traffic, it's kind of transmitting in the blind. Report each traffic pattern leg, which is hard to do sometimes, while listening and keeping a watchful eye out for other traffic, which is a lot. Remember, not all traffic have radios, and those that do don't always use it, in my experience. We're all responsible for see and avoid. There's this little picture here. Keep your eyes outside the airplane. My head probably blocks this off if that happened to you unplanned, and I can't read the rest of it. Outcome would not be good. Well, unless he's turning away. So that concludes our safety presentation for September. So this is Dennis Dalton, Safety Officer. Be safe out there.